Our main story tonight is income inequality. Last December, the president made it clear that income inequality was going to be a big priority.
The combined trends of increased inequality and decreasing mobility pose a fundamental threat to the American dream, our way of life, and what we stand for around the globe. I believe this is the defining challenge of our time.
The wealth gap is getting worse. A new analysis shows the richest Americans, the top 1%, made nearly 20% of all the available income in America last year. That's the widest income gap since the Roaring '20s.
Since 1980, the share of income for the top 1% of Americans has more than tripled, while our effective tax rates have gone down by 50%. The trillion, at least in the American economy, the $1 trillion elephant in the room is not raising taxes on rich people a little bit more. It is the transfer of wealth which has taken place over the last 30 years from workers to owners. In 1980, actually from 1950 to 1980, American corporations had about a 6% profit as a percent of GDP. Today, it's 12 or 13%. In the intervening period, labor as a percentage of GDP went down an identical amount. That's $1 trillion.
Contributing to poverty, stagnating wages. As this graphic shows, wages adjusted for inflation have been virtually flat during the past 45 years.
The Bureau of Labor Statistics has many different data sets which demonstrate how wages and benefits for working class people began falling in the 1970s and have been relatively flat ever since the early 1980s. This data set shows that weekly wages and benefits fell by $120 per week, roughly $6,000 per year between 1972 and 1980. And then since 1980, wages and benefits for workers have been flat ever since. And more than one source of data shows this information to us, that wages and benefits for working class people have basically stagnated for the last 40 years.
Oh, I say it again, you've been had.
I think most people are aware that for the last 40 years, the middle class of our country has been in decline. That in Vermont and all over this country, we have people working 2 or 3 jobs. We have people working 50, 60, 70 hours a week just to put food on the table, just to make sure that their families can live with a modicum of dignity. And the reason for all of that is that wages in the United States of America are just too low.
You've been had.
This is a CNN Money article from February 16th of 2011, titled How the Middle Class Became the Underclass. And it stresses the point that incomes for 90% of Americans have been stuck in neutral, and not just since the Great Recession of 2008. Middle class incomes have been stagnant for at least a generation, while the wealthiest tier has surged ahead. In 1908, the income of the average American taxpayer was $33,400, adjusted for inflation. Fast forward 20 years, and not much has changed. The average income is still just $33,000 in 2008.
Rocky, do you believe that America is the land of opportunity?
Yeah.
Today, a new study grabbed our attention. The middle class is no longer the majority in America. In 1971, 61% were considered middle class. Now that's down to 50%. Anthony Mason tells us why.
Meredith Riley, a 37-year-old social worker in New Jersey, used to think of herself as middle class.
It was the good life. It really was. It was wonderful. And now
her county job, which paid about $50,000 a year, was eliminated in the recession. A single mother of 2, Riley now works 3 part-time jobs and makes less money.
That's good because I work 3 jobs and I feel like I contribute.
You work 3 jobs?
3 jobs, yes.
Uniquely American, isn't it? I mean, that is fantastic that you're doing that. Get any sleep?
Not much. Not much.
I think the toughest part is not preparing a future for my children that my parents prepared for me.
Barely half of adults are now middle-income earners, defined as a household making between $42,000 and $126,000 annually. The percentage has been falling steadily since 1971. Richard Fry, who co-authored a new Pew Research study, says that as the middle class has hollowed out, the upper income bracket's grown from 14% to 21% of Americans. That upper class now takes home nearly half of all annual income in the U.S., 49%, up from 29% in 1970.
You've been took. You've been hoodwinked.
Do children end up doing better than their parents? So on the horizontal line is the year in which a child is born. So the first year that we have there is 1940, and the last year is 1985. And then you follow them into adulthood, and I think he's following them to age 30 or something, I can't remember exactly. Somebody born in 1940, 90% of those children ended up doing better than their parents in terms of earnings, their household earnings, okay? That stayed high for a while, but then it started falling and fell, so that somebody born in 1985 is currently earning only 50% of those children are actually doing better than their parents if you look at earnings and adjust for inflation.
The information alone contained in the first part of this video that wages have been stagnant for over 40 years is troubling and disturbing enough. But the next set of information the video is going to present to you makes the problem seem much, much, much more unfair.
Bamboozled. Led astray.
This is the table made from the data set from the Bureau of Labor Statistics about weekly wages and benefits per worker as they change over time. In the table we showed you earlier, made mention weekly wages and benefits were $782 per worker per week in 1972, and they fell and rose slightly again, and now they're $681 per worker per week for wages and benefits by 2010. The data set from earlier in the video is incomplete. The Bureau of Labor Statistic data goes back even further, and I'll show you the rest of the table as I scroll upward. Here is what was missing previously. Weekly wages and benefits in 1950 were $440 per week, or $11 an hour, $22,000 per year. That's what the average worker experienced in 1950. Just 6 years later, weekly wages and benefit had risen by roughly $100 per week, and had risen by almost $5,000 per year per worker. Just 9 years later, workers saw an increase of wage and benefits to $733 per week, which is $18 an hour. So wages for the average worker jumped up by $7 an hour, or roughly $15,000 per year in just 15 years. Most Americans are not aware of the economic history of the average worker. The average worker's wages, adjusted for inflation in $2,000, were $7 an hour from 1870 all the way to 1937. Workers didn't get any significant increase in their pay. There was a slight bump of workers' wages right around World War I, but basically every human worker in the United States earned $7 per hour from post-Civil War America for the next 50 plus years till 1937. Then Franklin Roosevelt authorized the creation of what was called the Wagner Act, which allowed workers to unionize. And in less than 43 years, workers saw their wages nearly triple, from $7 an hour to $20 an hour.
It's a fight we knew all too well in Flint, Michigan. For it was here that my uncle and his fellow workers first brought down the mighty corporate interests that dominated their lives. It was the day before New Year's Eve in 1936, and hundreds of men and women took over the GM factories in Flint and occupied them for 44 days. They were the first union that beat an industrial corporation and their actions eventually resulted in the creation of a middle class. But back in these days of the Flint sit-down strike, the police and the company thugs were not going to just stand by. After a bloody battle one evening, the governor of Michigan, with the support of the President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, sent in the National Guard. But the guns of the soldiers weren't used on the workers. They were pointed at the police and the hired goons, warning them to leave these workers alone. For Mr. Roosevelt believed that the men inside had a right to a redress of their grievances.
Now, this is adjusted for inflation using Bureau of Labor Statistic data, and it's using year 2000 as the base dollars. If you would adjust that to 2019 dollars, this worker compensation would be $29.95 an hour. The average worker in this country saw their wages rise from $7 an hour, roughly $14,000, $15,000 a year, to $60,000 a year, adjusted for inflation by 1973. Wages and benefits to workers have been falling since. The peak earning year for U.S. workers was 1973. The green line here shows how workers' wages have fallen, adjusting for inflation using the original methods used by Bureau of Labor Statistics from the 1950s to the 1970s. The Bureau of Labor Statistics changes how it calculates standard of living and inflation and doesn't take into account such things as property taxes or Social Security taxes. So the blue line is how they adjust for inflation today, which shows wages have been flat since 1973. A different interpretation shows wages have actually fallen dramatically. But no matter how you adjust for inflation, the reality is clear that from 1937 to 1973, a miracle happened, and workers had a boom in their income and standard of living. If you had any kind of U.S. history class, you know this to be true. This is how we had the creation of Levitt towns, where people bought single-family homes in mass numbers in their early 20s for the first time. In 1965, the Mustang was introduced, and they sold over 1 million 65 and 66 Mustangs, as this became the second car for housewives. The boom in prosperity of the 50s and 60s was caused by more than doubling of workers' income in less than 15 years.
America's the greatest land of all, on a highway or a road along a levee.
To Europeans still locked in the grey post-war years, America appeared as a land of plenty. Undamaged by the war, it was more prosperous than ever. A mass migration was underway from the crowded cities to the new suburbs. At Levitt Town in New York, they completed 40 houses a day. For $100 down payment, ordinary Americans could buy into a new way of life.
It was a perfect little house, and it came with a refrigerator and a stove and a washing machine. Unheard of, unbelievable. I mean, usually if you bought a house, you had to buy all those appliances and put them in, but they came with the house. So it was the answer to a dream. We have 9 Olympic-sized swimming pools. The ladies took the children up to play in the pool. And
for example, it was only a little more than half a century ago that the average worker had only inefficient tools to help him turn out a product. Low production meant low wages. In 1900, many men had to work 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, to earn enough money to provide their families with the bare essentials. Hand labor was the rule in the home as well as the factory. In many families, the youngsters had to work to add their earnings to the family budget and forego the opportunity to get an education. And with most families in those days, the standard of living left much to be desired. A half century later, we had invested enough in our business system to provide the average worker with efficient and expensive buildings and machinery to enable him to produce enough in a 40-hour week to earn twice as much as the 1900 worker earned in a 60-hour week. This shorter work week gives us all more leisure time to enjoy a standard of living beyond the wildest dreams of anyone who lived a half century ago. The more we earn, the more our families have to spend for the things they need and want. Young people today have leisure time for fun and enjoy educational opportunities denied their fathers and grandfathers.
Sat and chatted and talked while the kids were swimming.
The first supermarkets were opening up in the 1950s, changing the way people shopped. A family could now find everything they needed and more under one roof. To Europeans only just ending rationing, the American abundance seemed beyond their reach. And the gap was huge. The average American's income was twice as high as the British workers and 4 times as high as the Italians.
This video is part 1 of a 3-video series of how the United States once had a more than doubling of a standard of living for the average worker from 1937 to 1973. And the core idea of this doubling of a standard of living was that when workers got more productive, here in orange, their wages rose with their productivity gains. The next video in this series is the most important video I think I'll ever post to my YouTube channel, because it explains how you can have a rising standard of living, a doubling of wages in roughly 22 years, and steady or falling prices for the average American consumer. This idea is called Fordism, and this is the idea that created the American middle class, and this is the idea our country has forgotten. So please tune in and watch the next video in this series.